Welcome to BrainSTEM, the podcast for anyone curious about the brain, brain development, and brain disorders. I'm your host, Dr. Hilary Marusak. Today's episode explores bipolar disorder through two powerful lenses: lived experience and scientific inquiry. Our guest, Dr. Maya Schumer, is both a researcher and someone with personal experience navigating bipolar disorder. We'll talk about mood, brain science, stigma, creativity, treatment, and what it means to study something that you also live with. Maya, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Hilary.
I'm so excited to chat with you. And for folks who are viewing the video, you have to see what's behind Maya right now. It is like a beautiful sight. And actually, do you mind sharing a little bit about, before we jump in, that poster is behind you?
Yeah, so I'm right now in my home office. I'm based in Belmont, Massachusetts, just right outside of Boston. And behind me is a painting titled Hope is a Choice. And that's the text that could be seen here. And then above is a brain in red, and on the far right is a pill with a bunch of lines around it meant to draw attention to it. And this painting was created by my mother, artist Sherry Wolfgang, and this was created as part of her series that she did about our family's journey with my biological father's bipolar disorder, where this pill is lithium, and this is meant to represent that, hope, the idea that someone might need a treatment that maybe could save their life. Sometimes when you're down, really in the depths of depression, to have hope can sometimes be a choice, a very difficult choice.
Yeah, and thank you. That's a really nice kind of segue into your story. And I know you've got a ton to share about your family's experience and your own personal experience, and then that message of hope and recovery, which we'll get to towards the end. But first, start by just sharing a little bit about your story. Like, when did you first start experiencing mood changes? Tell us a little about your family if you feel comfortable.
Sure. So I'm 32 years old, and I have been living with bipolar disorder since I was 20, so for the past 12 years. But before that, I grew up with a parent with bipolar disorder, my biological father. And understanding that came after I was able to intuitively understand that my dad was different from other dads, and that he couldn't parent in the same way that my mom could. It was just a limitation. And we learned to cope and work with him versus with what he could do. But it could still be very difficult because when he was manic, it was very disruptive for everyone in the house. And from a young age, the way I reacted to that was by beginning to scratch my skin, which at the time, no one knew what skin picking disorder or could conceptualize self-harm in a child at that time. So they were calling it eczema. But that was the beginning of me showing, signs and symptoms of distress and anxiety at dealing with this. And then when I got older, in my late teens and 20s, I was very, very into my academics. I really threw myself into my academics in middle school, high school, and sometimes to a very, extreme extent. And looking back, the way that I took to it may have been interpreted as a little bit of hypomania, some of the behavior that I had at that time. And in college, when I was summer after freshman year, I tried Zoloft, and that triggered at the time a clearly manic reaction, and hallmark sign of emerging bipolar disorder is an adverse reaction to SSRIs, especially when there's a family history, which I had a strong family history. But and at that time it was my mom and my adoptive father and my sister supporting me, and we knew what happened with my dad, who was no longer in my life. We kind of knew what to do in some ways, and I knew when I finally got diagnosed when I was 20, all of the signs were there, and irritability was that missing piece. And what started off as depression, it went into rapid cycling. And because of the trauma of what happened with our family and with my dad, we almost were blind to the fact that it could happen to me. So when I did get diagnosed, it was very surprising. And while, again, we took to it well, I was certainly compliant. I used to think that compliance, agreeing to be hospitalized at that time because I was very suicidal, agreeing to take lithium, although a very, very high dose, that I thought was acceptance. And I learned over time that that was just compliance. Those are very different, very complex and nuanced concepts. And then, so over the past decade, I finished college, I did a PhD in neuroscience, and But over that time, I was never asymptomatic. I won't use the word stable. I use asymptomatic for longer than 2 to 3 weeks at a time, which
Wow.
essentially means that I was dealing with, instability for a decade.
Yeah.
And it was very difficult to concentrate. I would have panic attacks every day. My focus was sporadic. I was having, constant. At first, it almost looked like bipolar type 2, which is
Hmm.
another subtype of bipolar disorder characterized more by hypomania rather than mania and more episodes of depression. So when I was first diagnosed, my patterns looked more like that, rapid cycling depression. And then as the years went on, almost more mixed states, which is when you're experiencing mania and depression at the same time. This can be agitated depression or depression with hypomanic features. And then when I got to graduate school, it changed into more pure mania
Mm.
with psychosis. And so it became clear that I was type 1, but also over time, even though in some ways I was growing more mature, I was trying to take better care of bipolar, taking the medications, trying to have a strict sleep schedule and, weekly therapy, weekly psychiatry. The severity of my illness got worse and worse and worse, and taking care of it got harder and harder. And
Right.
all the while, of course, I was dealing with chronic suicidality. That was like a
Yeah.
constant growing presence. And when I finally graduated from University of Pittsburgh, where I got my PhD, and I moved here to Boston to start my postdoc fellowship at McLean Hospital and Harvard Medical School, I started working with a new psychiatrist who, unbeknownst to me, was also an expert in metabolic psychiatry.
Hmm.
When I arrived here, transitions can be very, difficult for anyone, but especially in bipolar disorder, it was very difficult for me. The transition from PhD to postdoc, moving to a new place, a
Right.
bunch of changes were happening, and it completely destabilized me more than I already was. And and this was back in Pittsburgh, I was able to get by, but it wasn't stability. Even my PhD defense, I had to give it a manic state. I had to win.
Wow.
The thing is, it still went well because I like presenting and the data anchored me. I knew the data, but it was a
Wow.
very stressful experience nonetheless. But I knew that I wanted to study this. So then when I got here, it was a big cycle of starting from, over the course of 8 months, I'd gone from kind of okay to full on, suicidal depression. And I ended up trying a ketogenic diet, which I only did because I was so suicidal that I did not care anymore. And I
Wow.
was still afraid of lithium because 10 years ago when I was hospitalized, the hospital put me on a very high dose
Hmm.
and I had a negative reaction and then I refused it for 10 years because of the trauma associated
Yeah.
with that experience. And in hindsight, I ended up needing not just a ketogenic diet, but also a low dose of lithium. And that combination really clicked for me and gave
Okay.
me, for the first time in my life, a really new sense of stability. And
Yeah.
that's what I've been able to, really grow in and get more and more secure in here in
Yeah.
Boston as I do my
And
postdoc work.
for sure. And that's been over the past 2 years. You finally felt this sense of stability. Is that right?
Yes, I started a ketogenic diet in July 2024. I moved to Boston in January 2024. Started it in July, and I started it at the time I could not do it on my own. And
Yeah.
the thing about a ketogenic diet for SMI, serious mental illness, is that it's really key to have someone overseeing it, whether it's a clinician trained in ketogenic therapy, a physician, metabolic psychiatrist. So you need support, and I could not get into the diet without support. So that I was one of the first participants in this program called Accord, which is a metabolic psychiatry residential treatment program here in the Boston area.
Yeah.
And directed by Dr. Matthew Bernstein, also of Ellenhorn, and he is also my treating psychiatrist.
That's
So
amazing. Yeah.
timing of my keto transition was good because this program was just starting, and
Right.
it was really, I needed help getting into it. I couldn't have done it on my own, and we had to make several tweaks over the course of the months following because it wasn't a light bulb switch for me, but it really did save my life. And later, I needed also IV ketamine infusions and
Mm.
accelerated TMS. But that combination was what I needed to climb out of this most suicidal depression I ever had and live and choose to live. And I think we really need to embrace and be talking about medical pluralism, the idea that multiple treatments or approaches could be important and can be recognized at once as having value, and sometimes
Right.
needing to be collaborative.
Yeah, and that brings us nicely back to the beginning when we were looking at the beautiful painting by your mom behind you, when you said if you were to edit that today, you would include for you the ketogenic diet and IV ketamine and accelerated TMS and all of these tools. You were able to find your perfect treatment. But I think that's a really nice message, is that there's not like one magic pill for everybody. Everybody is unique, right?
Mm-hmm. And I think with some of the, pushback we're seeing from folks about the ketogenic diet after RFK called it, say that people were using it as a cure to cure schizophrenia and bipolar, we know that that's not really true. Cure is not really an accurate word. Remission is different. Needing to stay on a ketogenic diet to have remission, that doesn't mean a cure. That means this is the treatment that I need to stay on. And but remission is still very, very important and can be really, really impactful for people who are very, very debilitated and disabled by these illnesses. But really, any treatment that has that impact should be one that we have great interest in, to understand it, to understand why it works for some and may not work for others, but to understand it nonetheless.
Right. And more research to really study for who and for what. Exactly. Yeah. And for folks who are interested, I will definitely link to Maya's article in the New York Times that was published recently. So kudos and congrats to that for more information. I want to circle back to the keto diet, and I want to go back to what you started with, which is kind of your early childhood. So you painted a really nice picture about, different physical manifestations even of your mood disorder, like people thinking the skin scratching was eczema. And then you talked a lot about this kind of irritability. And I've never thought about the fact that, well, one, you're a brilliant scientist, but just throwing yourself into academics and being a good student and trying to be a good patient and being compliant, quote unquote, like those were all kind of symptoms of what was happening to you. And even for someone with that family history, like you said, it even kind of blindsided you. So can you speak a little bit more about like what does that process look like to be kind of bounced around to different, physicians and folks, and not really having that clear answer as you're going through this yourself? Like how did that feel?
I think in the beginning, it was very scary. When I was when it was the beginning of college, about a few months before I got formally diagnosed, before things hit the fan, so to speak, I had this feeling. I was starting to get, more consistently depressed, but I had this innate feeling, and I shared with my parents, I feel like something bad's going to happen. And I feel like something's like happening in me. Like I didn't really have the words to understand or to describe, what was going on, but it felt like things were about to change, but it was going to be bad. And then, a few months later, the missing pieces were coming together. I think, bipolar can often be misdiagnosed as unipolar major depression without that clear history of mania, or being able to report that you've had a history of mania. And my history of mania, or probably what was more hypomania at the time, wasn't abundantly clear to all of us because we weren't looking for it, but having the family history was really helps trying to sort of cement that, and the other thing is that growing up, I had a lot of, childhood trauma. There was a lot of verbal violence with my biological father when he wasn't well, and that loudness created a very unstable and at times scary environment for me as a child, and I was exposed to a lot of that. And I think that when you combine, childhood elements of childhood adversity and trauma and being exposed to abuse and stress, and add in the genetics, I think those two things can be associated both separately with a diagnosis of bipolar disorder, but I had all of it together. So it was almost like a perfect storm. And then when I was before I was diagnosed, I was down in Florida visiting my grandmother with my mom, my aunt, and that's when I could tell things were really starting to change. That's when I didn't have the language at the time to say this was bipolar, but here's what I used. Mm-hmm. When my mood was starting to cycle, going in and out of depression, I color coded it. So pink was like, feeling okay, feeling good. Periwinkle was what I called feeling cloudy, almost, kind of not quite good, but not quite bad. Mm-hmm. And gray was flat, like my mood was flat affect. And then black was like the depths of hell here, the depression. There were nights where I was screaming out in pain and none of us knew what was going on. I couldn't, and I don't have a lot of memory of this. I feel like I must have blocked some of it out, but we didn't know what this was. And, if we hadn't had such trauma from the previous experience with my biological father, maybe we would have picked up on the fact that, I'm having an adverse reaction to Zoloft. That should be a sign. Mm-hmm. We didn't. And again, the family history, but having a family history does not guarantee that you will get diagnosed. Right. But certainly that may have helped explain some of these emerging signs.
Right.
So my mom decided to fly us back up to my hometown of Connecticut to see my treating psychiatrist at the time, who was in Connecticut. And on the plane, I was yelling at people when they were unloading the plane, having people come off the plane. I was yelling at people to move, and my mom was noticed. That was very out of character for me, something I would never do. And I was also very irritable down in Florida as well, snapping at everyone around me, which is also very out of character for me. So it was the irritability. The depression was going like this, which should have been a sign, but the irritability was a missing piece there. The family history, likely hypomania with my academics, that was everything that was required to really diagnose it formally.
Wow. Yeah. And you've painted a good picture. I mean, the color coding is really, really kind of poignant to me, but can you, for listeners, tell us a little bit more about like what these mood states feel like? So walk us through like what mania and psychosis and depression feel like to you.
So I would not refer to bipolar disorder or describe it strictly as a mood disorder. I find that very reductive because mania is, I say this kind of jokingly, but it's true. It's not just a mood, like it's not a lifestyle, but it's not a mood. And I think a mood disorder, we're excluding a lot of more complexity that belongs to many people's experiences of bipolar disorder. Makes sense, yeah. So for me, depression isn't feeling sad. There's a lot of anger associated with it, a lot of almost like inner paralysis that I can't get out of this, and there's then a claustrophobia. I'm trapped in this. I'm angry. I am sometimes what it almost feels like to mourn when you're in it, when it's really, really bad. You're mourning, living and the idea of life. And for me, it's also accompanied by heavy suicidality. And sometimes your body feels like a brick. It's very physical. When I'm in more mania for me has been increasingly associated with a lot of like psychomotor activation. Sometimes I cannot stop moving, and light hypersensitivity, sensory overload, and some of these features are seen in people in autism. And I think there's some overlap here. Sometimes I have to do like clapping and running around and doing repetitive movements to get myself to stop moving, to calm me down, because this is very anxiety inducing. It also for me has been associated in the past with overspending, with hypersexuality. And in these experiences, it was like my brain was playing a trick on me, and I was enjoying this experience, but I wasn't aware that it was actually a dangerous, risky experience for me, and that there were things that I did that I did not want to do. Right. And I still hold so much stigma and shame in these aspects of mania, and many people do, because these are the experiences that it can look like to some that, I'm doing this on my own accord, but I don't feel like I have full control in that moment. Right. And sometimes I do not have control. And luckily, I've been able to sort of break out of that trance, but it's been very, very distressing as soon as that happens.
I can imagine.
For me, and then rarely in depression, but sometimes in depression, I will have psychosis, which for me, what that looks like is it's always the same patterns, the same themes. There's objects on the wall or in the room, whatever room I'm in, or if I'm outside, things like trees that are looking at me that become suspicious. And that can feel very scary to me. And even, when I'm in a more insightful state, I still am aware that this may not be real to others, but it's real to me. Even so, it's very, very distressing. And over time, I've learned to kind of realize that I don't have to pay attention to those things, depending on, the level of distress that I'm in. If I'm able to just acknowledge that those things are looking at me, but I don't have to look at them, that's been a really great tool in helping me disengage from some of the stimuli that are dangerous to me in this state.
Yeah.
And then in a mixed state, when I'm having elements of mania and depression at the same time, that's definitely one of the more painful states because it feels like your brain is on fire. And what I mean by that is this is the episode where I'm having elements of depression. So again, that claustrophobic, I'm trapped in this brain, I'm trapped in this body, I hate how I feel, I can't get out of it, I'm stuck like this. And then some of the overstimulation and, can't move, and you have this energy, you feel like a brick combined with you have this energy that has no place to go from the mania. And in this, I'm usually screaming out like in pain when it's like this. And luckily, much of the time, my mom has been with me to quite literally hold me while I am just waiting for it to end.
Oh my gosh.
And the feeling of your brain being on fire is something that I've spoken about with some other people who've had mixed episodes, and they agree that this is, sometimes what it feels like.
Wow. And how long do those episodes usually last for you?
So what I'll say, like being in a mixed state can last several days, but then within that, some people will refer to that state as an episode, and I also can agree with that. But for me, it's almost like accentuated within those few days by severe moments, which to me are the episodes. Like I'm in a mixed state, but I'm having mixed episodes while I'm within the state. And people can disagree or agree about this. It might be like, preference of jargon or how you want to talk about it, but that's what it feels like to me, where then I can be in a manic state for a week, but there will be moments or real parts of that will be much more intense compared to the rest of the experience, if that makes sense. It's very dynamic.
No, that was a beautiful explanation, Maya, and I completely understand and agree with you saying that mood disorder does not capture that entire experience, where it's a range of even physical sensations and sensory almost. So thank you for painting that picture. For listeners who might not be familiar with the different types of bipolar, could you define bipolar 1, bipolar 2?
Mm-hmm. So bipolar 1, bipolar 2, and then there's even bipolar not otherwise specified, or NOS. Those are some of the main subtypes within bipolar disorder. So bipolar 1 is what we'll call a classical mania, like severe mania that can last several days, accompanied often by psychosis and then depression and mixed states. Whereas, it'll often feature more mania, where then bipolar type 2 will feature more, often more depression, and then hypomania, which is like a less intense experience of mania. Although I really will say that's quite subjective. And I think that when we say things like less intense, do we really even know what that means for a given person? I agree with the subtypes, but I also think that there's nothing's absolute. There's nothing to say that you could go on having hypomania and then one day have a full manic episode. But it's really about patterns and what each individual kind of, cycles through, what they tend to have when they're cycling through, whether it's depression or mixed depression or full-blown mania or mania. It's really, I think, person-centered, but those tend to be the two subtypes of bipolar disorder. And then NOS would be any, other types of bipolar that maybe don't subscribe so cleanly to those subtypes. But I think that, again, it's mania and hypomania that define bipolar disorder, and that separate it from all other psychiatric disorders.
Right. Very unique in that respect. And I think you painted a picture, too, of how hard it is to diagnose and identify these things. And even in your own life story, when as a child it looked like something different than when you were a teenager, where it was more hypomanic, and then full-on mania, and then mixed episodes. So really taking the full life course to really understand. So a lot of helpful information there, Maya. Thank you for sharing. In the time we have left, I do want to pivot a little bit to your career as a researcher, and you're a fantastic researcher in this area. You're one of the only people I know that are like an expert in all aspects of bipolar, which is super cool to chat with you. But I want to hear from you, like as a researcher, how does your lived experience come into play in the questions you ask, like how you interact with people in the field, how you conceptualize bipolar, any aspect?
So I think that I've gotten more comfortable engaging with that and gotten more confidence in engaging with that as I've gotten more stable over time. And I was diagnosed at 20, and at that time I was in college. When I was a graduate student, I think a lot of my PhD, which was completed at University of Pittsburgh under the mentorship of the brilliant Dr. Mary Phillips, that was about really honing my skills, to properly study bipolar disorder. I learned how to do a meta-analysis. I trained in statistical methods. I did cross-sectional neuroimaging analyses. And I think at that point, it really benefited me to, have such great mentorship. And I wanted to solve bipolar disorder when I got into her lab. But to actually do that, I had to learn, won't be done within the scope of your PhD or even in the scope of a postdoc or a K or an R. It's a long-term thing. And I had to learn. And, thankfully, Mary was an excellent mentor in helping me really curb my enthusiasm, so to speak. I had to balance and learn to balance and accept that I'll feel an urgency, a sense of urgency, as many researchers do, to solve this. But when I'm literally living with it, that sense of urgency is just, exponential. But I have to understand that if I'm going to do this, I need to work within what I'm able to accomplish within the scope of whatever program I'm in, but also with what's available and what's logistical at that time. I'm not saying don't dream, but I had to learn to iterate and, work within, what was possible for me. So my PhD was really amazing because I got to have a good amount of rope to really go out and read the entire field of bipolar disorder imaging. And from that, we did a large-scale meta-analysis because I wanted to understand, okay, if we're going to look in the brain for what are risk markers of bipolar disorder, what would those be? Well, we need to first understand, what's reproducible and reliable among all of these studies of brain imaging and bipolar disorder. Because bipolar disorder is not only phenotypically heterogeneous, so is neuroimaging, and a lot of neuroscience with whatever subfield you're in, there's all these different methods and parameters, and people are doing it in different ways. So I think that in my PhD, it was really cool to do this meta-analysis of bipolar disorder imaging studies and really see, okay, well, what is reproducible? And we found several findings that converged across, over 200 studies in bipolar disorder that helped confirm and evolve these neural models that we've had of bipolar disorder. And then when I was going into my postdoc, I think naturally as a postdoc, you'll have some more independence. So here I've gotten to almost let my lived experience inform my work a bit more. And it's meant to be additive. I don't view it as adversarial. And I think can be stigma within the field and pushback from within the field and just academia that lived experience is incompatible with scientific excellence. And we like to, other researchers with lived experience, and I want to push back on that because we're trained to try to achieve the same level of scientific excellence as everyone else. Mm-hmm. We need accommodations, but that doesn't mean we are less or that we're not capable. Right. We need what we need to get through the program and make great science. And it shouldn't matter what that is.
Absolutely.
And so I think that now as I also am more stable and able to think much more clearly, because in mania, I was unable to think. I could not read. And what I mean by that is the letters and words on the page do not make sense to me. And I dealt with that so much for the first decade of living with bipolar disorder. So trying to do a PhD in undergrad when you cannot focus and it's very random and sporadic adds the stress, and stress triggers episodes. So it was all a terrible feedback loop. But now that I'm, able to have a much calmer mind and I don't need a stimulant anymore even to focus, I'm able to, I think, harness my lived experience even more and help use it to ask other questions. And when we did this meta-analysis of those 200 something studies, only 8% were studies that looked at individuals in a manic or mixed state. And those are the defining states of bipolar disorder, which begs the question, are a lot of the neural models that we have based on non-manic states, which would be, a large gap then that we have. Mm-hmm. So I've decided I want to spend a lot of my postdoc and future career really focusing on mania and mixed states and the dynamics of bipolar disorder. Because if you think about bipolar disorder as a dynamical system, which it's the perfect candidate for, as it's naturally episodic and dynamic, if you look at it like this, here's the dynamics of bipolar disorder. A lot of what we've looked at so far is almost the bottom half, going
Right.
depression into euthymia, and euthymia is sometimes called normal mood or remitted mood. But we're missing a lot of studies on the top half, what it means to go, what leads to mania, how does mania manifest from depression and from euthymia and from risk and going from risk to recurrent mania. We don't really have as good of an understanding as that. So that's what I'm focusing on. And I recognize, I understand what it means to live with mania and why that's important, but that's really what I want to focus on. But even more so, I think my lived experience, on finally having stability, achieving remission for the first time, and having it be real this time, that's inspired me to want to focus on not just what leads to instability in my, but stability, which is, I think, the other half of the equation that we haven't fully interrogated with.
Yeah, no, and I think again, your experience and your professional training and mentorship under Dr. Phillips has really given you like a bird's eye view of the field and what are the gaps, and also like don't discount yourself. Like you are paving the way for people with lived experience to be researchers and to not have to deal with the stigma that you outlined. And yeah, I think just your advocacy and your research and the way that you talk and think about these questions and on a human level, because this is something that you've experienced and felt to your core, like you have so much leadership in this field, and I'm just so excited to see what you do next. So just wanted to say that at the outset. But besides kind of the gaps in terms of like, you mentioned a ton of gaps in terms of like academia and mental health research and even our healthcare system, but I know you said you can still think big, but within kind of reason or within like more incremental stages. Like if you were to think big, like how would you wave your magic wand and like fix some of the things going on? Like what would be on your short list of things to fix, either for research, mental health, treatment, or mental health systems broadly?
I think so. 1 in 5 people with bipolar disorder die by suicide globally. And I'm sure, as we know, with stats reporting suicide, the numbers are probably much higher. And, suicide is it's a very human problem, because many people will naturally have thoughts of death, but we're not encouraged to talk about them, and even more so to talk about them with such complexity. And I think so when someone is having a crisis, or they're having, anytime they're talking about suicidality is interpreted as an acute crisis, which means hospital, which means police, which means handcuffs, which means criminalization, or which means death in some cases, or, involuntary commitment. And one of the things that I wish I could, if I could wave my wand, would be to really change the way that we're able to receive and talk about suicidality. And especially when it is chronic, because suicide prevention really is not up to the doctor or to the family. It's up to the person dealing with it. Because once you leave the hospital, suicidality, it's not like a binary thing. You're not suicidal and now you're not. It can come back. It is dynamic and it can evolve in complexity over time.
Right.
So having care models that are more person-centered and tolerant and empathetic of suicidality in a way that doesn't mean we have to rush you to the hospital or shut you down. We really need these more flexible systems that, of course, are also, responsive and have humility and are culturally sensitive. And I think that when I lived in Pittsburgh, I've experienced going to the hospital for suicidality with by the police and being handcuffed after what I at the time was a half-baked attempt. And that was very, very traumatic in so many ways, but it was so much silence, and there was when you're put in handcuffs and put in the back of a police car because you tried to kill yourself and it didn't work, or you freaked out, the way that feels is so just different than the way it would feel if you were in a much more open environment, led by perhaps peer health researchers or peer specialists.
Mm-hmm.
You're taken into a community versus shoved in a car and sent to, a state hospital. We really, really, really need, I think, to embrace and look to peer-led alternatives for crisis-based care, especially in psychosis and in bipolar disorder and depression. And I think that these could really mitigate and alleviate and just bypass a lot of the harm and trauma that's done when you're in these states and it's handled by someone else that isn't trained to do that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the trauma of that experience, the stigma, the self-stigma that you mentioned earlier, like all of that. I love that solution. If you had one thing at the moment, I'm sure there's like 20 others. But I do want to ask you this question. So I feel like bipolar has been romanticized a lot in the, you're already rolling your eyes. I love that. But, you're so creative and, there's this whole link between creativity and mania. So what's your perspective or take on that?
So first of all, interestingly, what got me wanting to study bipolar disorder was my biological father was very creative, and I wanted to understand, there seems to be a link. And I read the Dr. K. Redfield Jamison canon, and she has a book on Touch with Fire that's more about, this association. We can't really claim causation here. And I think that, for some people, that is their truth. And I say this as someone where this illness has almost killed me. And for that, I am still being told that there's good sides to it. And this is the only illness and psychiatric disorder that we say there's a good side to it. And my question is, why are we doing millions of dollars worth of research to try to prevent it, to try to end it, to try to treat it, to try to, in risk related, looking at, individuals who are at risk for it, how do we prevent them from getting it? Well, what does that say? And I think these two things seem to be, they're coexisting. But for me personally, for people where it is part of their identity, that's fine. But we need to reconcile this with the people who have lost their lives and livelihoods to bipolar disorder, the people who have died by suicide and aren't in the room with us to offer their experiences.
Yeah.
So I sort of tune out that because I personally believe that it is important to me to, treat what has been so disabling to so many people. And of course, again, this is many people's truths, and that's fine. But my truth is that this illness, 1 in 5 people, probably more, die by suicide with this. And, the creativity can sometimes be a part of mania, but often that part, for some people, lasts long and is less common than the mixed mania part.
Wow, I've never put it exactly like that, but you're exactly right. People don't say, "Oh, lucky you have depression. You're so like whatever it is," or "Good for you. Schizophrenia is not all bad. Like there's some good." Like no one says that.
And in the media, there's really no good media representation of bipolar. And I was rewatching Midsommar,
Yeah. Yep.
movie from 2019. I forgot that in the beginning, the character who loses her family, it's because her sister has bipolar, so she killed herself and their parents. Now, this really perpetuates the very harmful stereotype that people with mental illness are the perpetrators of violence, when much more is the case. They are the victims of this violence, the victims of this trauma and institutionalization. And that was like a recent movie. That's 2019. The media does us no favors in making it worse. Wow. So when I go out and I decide to publicly disclose that I have bipolar disorder, I can use my narrative to push back against as much stigma as within my power. But that's an uphill battle when you have movies like this, deciding that this is what bipolar disorder is.
Right. Yeah. Or oversimplifications. And you hear this in like kind of lay talk all the time. Like if you have like a really good morning and then a terrible evening, oh my gosh, you're so bipolar. Like that doesn't help, I'm sure. Right.
No. And it's like, every movie that comes out, I've never seen Homeland with Claire Danes, but I've seen Silver Linings Playbook, which is what I would sometimes think is like a close to okay depiction. But even like the event that they use to show that the main character has bipolar, Bradley Cooper, is that he beat up the guy that he saw his wife cheating on with, like in their home. Now the thing is that I could understand that reaction, a lot of anger, betrayal, but is that really the hallmark? And then he was hospitalized for 8 months because of that. Is that really the hallmark sign of bipolar? No, not really. And we know it's mania and hypomania, so that seemed a very odd. The rest of the movie I thought was okay, but that seemed like a very odd catalyst to show that this is why this character has bipolar or is bipolar.
Right. Yeah.
If you're gonna do it with more, care and get it right. Like, talk about mania, but even that, I'm sure, would be, someone, they would make a caricature of it in the media.
Yeah, consult with experts.
It's not possible, I think, for the media to neutralize mental illness or bipolar. It's either sensationalized or it's stigmatized, but it's never in the middle ground.
That's a really powerful. I've been writing down like all these taglines. I'm like, oh my gosh, Maya, you have so many nice little like tidbits. But oh my gosh, I could talk to you forever. I think maybe to close, if I had to ask one more question, just resources. Like if you were just diagnosed, have a loved one who's going through this, what resources would you recommend for folks?
So in terms of resources, in terms of community, which is always beneficial, especially with something as stigmatized as bipolar disorder as it was in our community growing up, reaching out to find your local NAMI chapter, that's National Alliance of Mental Illness. And then, with regarding treatment, it really took a village, to get me well. But when it came to treatment, it wasn't, as we learned, it wasn't just one treatment that was important. Like, it wasn't all medication. It was complex and it was nonlinear. And in the end, it was collaborative and pluralistic. And I think that in this day and age, we can be more creative than just medications. And I'm not saying that medications aren't important. They can, and they are for many people. And you don't have to be, to be critical of psychiatry. You don't have to be anti-psychiatry. All of these perspectives can be important. So with that, I say Metabolic Mind is a really great resource for anyone interested in metabolic therapy, ketogenic therapy for bipolar disorder, which again, I would always stress should be, done under the supervision of a physician, a clinician, a nutritionist, someone with your provider. It's you need support. And I think in terms of like other really great resources for more information, the International Bipolar Foundation, or IBF, the International Society for Bipolar Disorders, or ISBD, those are both really great resources for all things bipolar disorder advocacy, research, and care, and the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We will link to all of those resources and more in the podcast bio, and I'll link to more information if you want to find out more about Maya and her amazing research. And if I may too, what you said, there's this huge anti-psychiatry movement, and I think for you, you're on the forefront. You got into research to help people. That is all researchers, that is all clinicians, like everyone wants to help. And I think you do a really good job of pointing out that what we all know, that there are real limitations to the research, to our current treatments, but that doesn't mean that, you're dedicating your life, for example, to helping other people with this condition. So I think that, there's just misperception out there, and I don't think that's true at all. If you want to say more about that.
I mean, a lot of people in the field come into it for a reason, whether it's personal lived experience or they have lived experience, caring for a loved one or they lost someone. It's a very human field, and it's a very human thing to go into a field because you've had an experience and you want to help others. And that is the bulk of our field. And I think that, it's all, run by human beings who care, and, research, I think, is something that is very, very collaborative and team-based, and we're all working together to do this. The problem, will always be the pace, because the pace of research is sometimes not as fast as all of us want it, because again, all of us had this urgency to, want to help people, for it to be done yesterday. But science needs to be done in a precise way, and there needs to be safeguards. There needs to be human protections if you're doing research with human subjects, and animal protections with animal subjects. So all of this is because we want research to be done in the right way so it can help people in the right way.
Exactly. And we need robust support for research funding to really help move this forward. So thank you so much, Maya. This was amazing. I really appreciate your time. It's always fun to chat with you.
Thank you for having me. This was great.
All right. Welcome back to BrainSTEM, the podcast for anyone curious about the brain, brain development, and brain disorders. I'm your host, Dr. Hilary Marusak. This is the second part of a two-part series where we're exploring one of the most complex and often misunderstood mental health conditions, bipolar disorder. We just heard from Maya Schumer in part one, who brought a personal story from someone living with bipolar disorder to complement the science with lived experience and practical perspectives. So make sure that you're staying along for the journey. And now, for this part two, we're joined by a leading expert in the field, Dr. Mary Phillips, who will share insights into the neuroscience of bipolar disorder, what happens in the brain, how it develops, and what research is revealing about treatment and recovery. And I just heard offline that we're going to get some really hot off the presses research findings from Mary today. So, Mary, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Hilary. Really excited to be here today and sharing with you all some of the work we've been doing in the lab and trying to unravel the mysteries of what goes on in the brain in people suffering from bipolar disorder.
Fantastic. Yeah. And to get a real picture of Mary's research reach, I would probably have to do like a 20-hour interview. So we'll hear a small part of it today, but I'm really excited. So let's start with the basics. So what is bipolar disorder and how does it affect the brain?
So bipolar disorder used to be termed a manic depressive disorder or manic depression. And by its very nature, it kind of is a complex disorder, a mood, emotional dysregulation disorder, which manifests as periods of very high mood called mania, which is really not so much about being happy. It's about being irritable, impatient, angry, a bit elated at times, all mixed together. And then coupled with that, we have the opposite pole of depression, which, as everybody knows, is low mood, helplessness, feeling just dreadful about everything. And what's so fascinating from a scientific point of view about bipolar disorder is that as well as these two poles going on, one and the other, they can cycle at varying different time levels and time frequencies. Sometimes these symptoms happen together and we call those mixed episodes. So it's very complicated. You have your highs, you have your lows. They can occur at the same time. They can occur days, weeks, months apart. And for most people, it's exhausting and awful. As you've heard from Maya, it's a challenge just coping sometimes day to day with regulating this, as you can imagine. As well as the mood, which is the primary, or is thought to be the primary concern, there's also a parallel disturbance in energy levels. And often people with bipolar disorder will tell you that, it's not just the mood that causes the problems, it's the energy. So you go from having too much energy when you're sort of in that periods of high to having none at all when you can't get out of bed. And again, these vary, and sort of vary between one and the other at different frequencies, often very unexpectedly. And so all of this is happening. And as you can imagine, it is exhausting for the brain, the mind, the body. And as a result, people with bipolar disorder, often have problems with other parts of their body as well as the brain. They have problems with their appetite and generally with their sleep. So all of these things combine together to be part of the disorder or syndrome that we call at the moment bipolar disorder. So it really is more than two poles. The word bipolar sort of tends to mean one and the other, but it's much more complicated than that. They can coexist, they can occur separately, and there's all the shades of grey in between. And at any point in time, a person can be suffering with any level of any of those things I've just talked about. So yeah, very debilitating, and if left untreated, extremely debilitating, as I'm sure you've heard already.
Yeah, no, and thank you for painting that picture too. You already kind of hit on some of the points that Maya underscored, which is that simply thinking about it as this two poles and just considering the mood state is not the whole picture. And I know we're going to talk about this later, but there's this tendency to kind of romanticize the mania, that it's so great, you're so creative, but you said awful, it's exhausting. So tell us more about like that aspect.
So mania is probably the most misunderstood of all psychiatric complications, syndromes, symptoms. The folklore, the legend is that people who are manic are very happy, they're very creative. We hear about all the actors and actresses in the past who were manic and that was great. But it's not like that at all. And Jameson's, who herself is a sufferer of bipolar disorder, has written about this very elegantly. How exhausting, how debilitating the mania is, because the problem is that people, when they're manic, or even when they're half the way to becoming manic, we call it little mania, hypomanic. What happens is that the insight, the knowledge of what's going on gets lost, and people don't understand. They can't, because the brain is sort of becomes miswired. They don't understand that this is actually causing problems. And sometimes people can go for days without sleeping, they're not eating, their energy is initially really high. They get themselves into all sorts of problems, rash behavior, impulsive behavior, spending too much money, gambling, this kind of stuff, doing wildly impulsive activities. And as you can imagine, this in itself causes problems, but ultimately the brain becomes exhausted. It wears itself out, and then people crash. And then that's when the turn to depression can happen. Yeah. But it's anything but this happy, creative state.
Right.
Sometimes people, when they're becoming a little high, hypomanic, they talk about it, I'm got out of the depression, now I feel better. And it's the contrast with the depression, of course, that might make people feel, I'm okay now.
Right.
But they're not.
Right.
And if left unchecked, this can become worse and worse. And you can imagine it becomes a vicious cycle. It becomes more and more and more problematic, and then the cycle continues. And in times before medication was available, this is exactly what happened. I always say, I remember my first patient that I saw, who was in hospital at the time when I was a medical student, way back many years ago, who was in a manic episode, very high. And was just running all over the place. And then suddenly he crashed. And the next day he was almost like a different person. He'd gone from being this sort of angry, impatient, irritable, running around to suddenly flat. And, it's quite dramatic to see. So it's not a good thing being manic. It's not stable. It's not going to stay. In of itself, it has all these problems, and then it can lead to a crash to depression. So it's dreadful. Yeah. And that's why we really need to focus on treating the mania as well as the depression.
Yeah. And it's so interesting to hear that these years later, you can still think about that, and you're framing it as an energy disorder is so fascinating. Yes. And I know it connects to some of your treatment innovations that we'll come back to in a moment.
Yes.
But
yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. So I know a lot of your career has been spent doing really pioneering work, just looking at, what is happening in the brain of someone with bipolar disorder. So can you describe what we know about that? Like, what does the brain structure function look like?
To me, it's fascinating, Hilary, understanding, just from a scientific point of view, isn't it incredible to think, how is it possible that the person who is a lovely person has this awful disorder? What's going on in their brain? How is it possible for the brain to be able to make someone experience such highs and lows, and sometimes at the same time, what's going on? So that is a question that has driven my research. So yes, what do we know? Well, one thing we do know is that the brain circuitry, we also call it neural networks or neural circuitry, but it essentially means all the regions in the brain that connect in some way to help us regulate our energy, regulate our mood. There's something dysfunctional, there's something not working correctly. Now, we now know over several decades that the regions that are particularly important to help us put a check on too much energy, put a check on too much mood in either direction, too much emotion, are regions in the prefrontal cortex. So that's the front of the brain, the area that allows us to think, to be more rational, to evaluate, to reflect, So those regions are thought to be underactive, shall we say, in given situations. It's much more complicated than that, though. But let me start with that. So first of all, there's this underactivity in regions that should come online. So when you get yourself into an emotionally demanding situation, you're going to regulate, you're going to put on the brake. So that's not working properly. Okay, that's a starting point. There are other parts of the brain which kind of do the opposite, that sort of are the energy makers, the emotion makers. They're sort of deeper in the brain, older parts of the brain. Regions such as the amygdala, striatum, these are regions that are kind of relay stations. They link together and they detect reward value. They detect what's important, salience, what's emotional. They help us sort of, attend to what is going on in the environment. Do I need to change my behavior accordingly? Mm-hmm. So what is thought to happen in bipolar disorder is that those regions are super active. They're active more than they should be in given situations. So you can imagine together we've got this yin and yang situation where normally top-down control happens to say, okay, enough already, regulate, relax, carry on. That doesn't work in bipolar disorder very well. But that having been said, it's much more complicated than that. And that was what we used to think. That was it. That was what's going on in the brains of people with bipolar disorder. But we now know, as I say, it's more complicated. And what we've been focusing on in the lab is really understanding what drives this sort of urge for sensation seeking, for impulsivity, for reward seeking that is there at the core of people with bipolar disorder. There's this sort of, if you will, this sort of vulnerability to getting too much excitement, to getting too involved with the thought, the possibility that some reward, some gain may be there for me. So typically people with bipolar disorder may have a lot of drive, which is good. But in the wrong context, that could be bad. So if you're driven to extremes to say, right, I've really got to go out there today and get money, I've really got to go and meet these people, it might not be appropriate that day. Those people might not want to meet you, blah, blah. You can see having that too much drive, having that too much focus on getting reward, getting the gains right now may turn against you. And it's known that people with bipolar disorder have that tendency. Now, what we've been doing is focusing on that tendency, what's going on in the brain to give people too much of that drive, too much of that. We call it reward sensitivity and impulsivity and sensation seeking. So that combination of personality traits, if you will, what is the cause of all of this? And that's the question we've been trying to answer. What we have found is that there are bits of the reward brain circuitry, particularly seated in prefrontal cortical regions that should know better. These prefrontal cortical regions, they are overactive. So unlike the prefrontal cortical regions that are meant to be the brakes on the gas, there are other prefrontal cortical regions that actually are more involved in considering reward, considering, this might be good for me. Let's go with the flow. In people with bipolar disorder, those are on overdrive. So if you can see, so you've got this problem to start with not able to regulate behavior and emotions, but then on top of that, you've got a problem with attending too much to what might be beneficial to you in the future, even though rationally it's not going to be. So it's a complicated situation. And what we've been trying to do is isolate those different prefrontal cortical regions into the ones that should be more active, they should be more regulatory, as opposed to the ones that are too active, too much involved in attending and pursue reward, potential reward. It's almost, imagine if you're going into, not that I do this, but if you go into a casino and there's actually
we were forced to at ACMP at a conference last year.
We had an ACMP conference which was basically at a casino. Well, interestingly enough, a lot of people in the casino were so focused on the gaming machines or the roulette that they were oblivious to us all walking through.
Yep.
Imagine somebody who's so fascinated and so attentive to the possibility of the reward. They don't even know that somebody else is walking past them. Right. They're so focused on going for that possible win. And that's what it's like in a nutshell for people with bipolar disorder. They want to get that win. They know that there's a possibility, so let's go for it. And we've been isolating the part of the brain that kind of allows people to make that calculation, to make people, that make people too sensitive to the possibility of reward. Yeah. And that's the beginning of where we start when we're thinking about, well, how do we turn that around? Yeah. How do we tackle that? How do we develop new treatments?
Amazing.
So it's kind of complex. So that's just the brain circuitry. We also know that it goes deeper than that. So if you just look at what I've been telling you, I'm telling you about regions in the brain and how they're connected and how they don't talk to each other properly. But we know that how brain regions talk to each other is, by modulation by chemicals called neurotransmitters, brain transmitters. And there's one in particular called dopamine, which many people have heard of. It's a sort of get up and go drive transmitter hormone chemical. And it's thought that people with bipolar disorder have too much of that. But they have too much of it in the particular regions in the brain that are involved in processing reward and being sensitive to reward. Not necessarily all over the brain, but just in these circuits that I've been telling you about. And you can imagine, therefore, that's what drives this overdrive in the reward circuitry. There's too much dopamine being produced and transmitted through that circuitry, which make people alert to the possibility of reward. So they're in the casino getting excited, even though they might have lost 3 rounds. They're still in it.
Holding on to that.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So now where in the brain these things are happening, the neurochemical signature. And I love the casino picture too, because I think everyone can kind of understand the idea that there's like an optimal level of things. Like you're like, optimal level of motivation. That makes total sense, because if you're not motivated to study for an exam, you're not going to do very well. But there's a point, when you're on your caffeine continuum too, where too much is negative. You start to get jittery.
Exactly. You're on overdrive, and then things start happening, like you don't get enough sleep.
Right.
You start not being able to sort out, woods and trees. Everything gets all blurred together. All you can focus on is, I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going.
Right.
And that is dangerous, very dangerous. And you see that happening. People drive themselves to distraction and get themselves into all sorts of difficult problems. I mean, as I was saying earlier, spending too much money, becoming impulsive in other actions, doing weird activities, putting themselves into dangerous situations, and not being aware of the danger either, not having insight into that. So we think it's to do with dopamine. It's not the only transmitter. There are other neurotransmitters almost certainly involved that regulate dopamine. So sort of downstream, if you will, sort of upstream from dopamine, there's abnormalities in chemicals and neurotransmitters and modulators that in turn regulate dopamine. And we're also interested in focusing on those as well.
Right.
So it all interlinks, and that's the kind of where we've been focusing our attention. And we do know, for example, that some of the treatments that are currently available for bipolar disorder, particularly mania, do touch on these transmitters. The problem is that the medications we have right now to treat bipolar disorder are a bit like blunt instruments, because what they do is they focus on the neurotransmitters regardless of where it is in the brain. In bits of the brain that are functioning quite normally, and indeed in bits of the body that also, where these transmitters are, those medications harm or affect those transmitters there. So they're covering everything when they really just need to be focused on one particular area of the brain or 2 areas of the brain. And that's the problem. And that's why we see all these side effects of the medications, sadly. But right now, that's all we have.
Right.
Or used to be the case.
Well, foreshadowing for sure. Yeah. And so with the kind of upside down U, like an inverted U, where there is some sort of optimal, you're saying the mania side of things is too much. How about the depressive side of things? Now, what is your research showing about what's happening in the brain there?
Yeah. So you can think of the depression as what happens when the energy's gone. So let's think about the dopamine. So I've told you that, there's too much dopamine, it's spread throughout the reward circuitry, it pushes people into overdrive. But there comes a point when the brain can't keep on making all that dopamine. It's like an engine with gas. At some point, the gas is going to run out. And what do you then do? And that's what happens. What we think is happening is that there's too much dopamine for whatever reason. We're looking into that right now. When it starts to become a problem, when the gas starts running out, when the dopamine starts running out, when the brain can't keep up with the demand, then we start to see a lag. And that's when the exhaustion kicks in. And what happens is that we then see people cycling back into depression. Sometimes they just crash into depression, like I was explaining with my first patient. The dopamine's, I can't keep up anymore. Wow. But it often doesn't happen immediately like that. It starts to gradually wane. And of course, along the way, what's happening is that the end, which I can say a little bit more about, the engines in the brain cells called mitochondria that make the energy, that for all cell functions, are starting to wear out. They're not working properly. Along the way, that's going to cause damage to the cells because they can't process the dopamine. They can't provide the energy to make the dopamine. So it gets very complicated, but essentially there's not enough dopamine being made in a good way. And at the same time, the dopamine that has been made, there's not enough energy to push it into the right direction. So it gets stuck in the cell and can cause damage, can cause, toxicity, as we say, to the cell. So, it's, if you think about it, it's not enough, too much dopamine, and then there's not enough energy to make that dopamine. And then the cell starts suffering as a result because there's not enough energy to make the dopamine. The dopamine gets trapped. It's not going in the right place. Too much dopamine left in the cell in itself can cause damage to the cell. So you can see it's a buildup. It's like a cascade of
the knock-on effect.
Things that can happen. Now, there are cutouts, obviously, and it's much more complicated than that. And we're only starting to begin to understand all the different steps. But that's the basic structure. And that's what we're working on at the moment, to try and tackle that problem by getting the energy to be more regulated, dopamine to be more regulated, and getting that reward circuitry to be more regulated.
Right.
And that's where we're focusing our attention.
No, that was awesome. And I want to move more to the treatment side. You keep alluding to things, and I'm like, yes. So first, start by telling us, what are the current treatments? You already talked about medications and some of their limitations, but what are the current treatments? What are you most excited about for more neuroscience-based interventions? And I know you're working on a lot of this.
Yeah, so the medications, I think most people will be aware, lithium, antipsychotic medications, which, more directly tackle dopamine. Dopamine is so there's so much there in the brain and very many different regions. And in the body. And there are many other, antidepressant medications are used. Okay, so we know that. I've talked about the problems being that they're blunt instruments. They don't just tackle one region in the brain. Okay, so there are all other current treatments available, and these are more like talking therapies. In combination with medication, there are therapies, there's a whole group of therapies that are targeting sleep-wake cycle, general energy regulation, which tends to go back to sleep-wake. So we call it circadian dysfunction. So it's when your circadian clock, the way you sleep and wake, is disrupted, which we know happens in people with bipolar disorder, all linked with the energy dysregulation and dopamine. So there are talking therapies, psychotherapies, which are targeting that and trying to make people more aware of their rhythm, their social rhythm, their sleep-wake, and trying to get them to do to sleep hygiene. So go to bed at certain times. Try not to travel across time zones too much, this kind of stuff. They work quite well up to a point, alongside some medication. But again, we still need treatments that target the core problem.
Not just put a Band-Aid.
Yeah, exactly. I have to say that the psychotherapies are excellent, and for some people, they're life-saving. In Pittsburgh, Adam Frank and colleagues really developed this interpersonal social rhythm therapy, and Holly Schwartz in Pittsburgh is really working with that too. It really is very helpful, but it doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and it often needs to be in combination with medication. So what we are trying to do, as I said, is target the cause and target some of the causes. So I can tell you a little bit about two types of new treatment that we are aiming to develop, and we're some way along now. One is a kind of a brain stimulation method. Now, by brain stimulation, I just want to clarify, there are many different types. And when I say brain stimulation, a lot of people immediately think about like ECT or deep brain stimulation. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about a non-invasive brain stimulation, which means that, it's like a probe that's put on there, on the scalp. And basically it transmits a signal, a sonication level, or electromagnetic wave, which is focused on a specific region in the brain to either ramp it up in terms of its activity or ramp it down. And we have been focusing on that part of the reward brain circuitry that is overactive in people with bipolar disorder, the bit that makes people go on overdrive and be sensitive to reward. So we're focusing on that region. And I am not allowed to say too much, but I can give you a bit of a spoiler alert that we are showing that if we do target that region and ramp it down, we are seeing good effects.
That's amazing. Very targeted, as you said, not that blunt force instrument.
Very targeted. This is in people predominantly with bipolar disorder type 1, which is the one that really sort of switches between the high mania and the low depression, the full range. And we are seeing some very promising effects.
Wow.
Now, watch this space. That's all I'm really allowed to say.
We will link to it when it comes out.
But we're very excited about that because this is the first stage. It
That's
basically is
groundbreaking.
engagement. We've shown literally we can engage the target and we can show downstream effects, good effects on the mania-like symptoms that people suffer with.
Wow. Yeah. Without inducing a full seizure.
Trial. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's one type of intervention. And the other type, I think a lot of people might be interested in this, and you might have probably heard a bit about this from Maya, is nutritional, interventions. And we've been particularly interested in nutritional ketogenic therapies, whereby the idea here is to tackle all that energy powerhouse in the cells that I was saying earlier, the bit that may be on overdrive initially and then gets worn out, the mitochondria. And so ketogenic therapies are essentially a way of trying to reverse that overdrive and trying to regulate those mitochondria. Now, how it works is this. Ketogenic therapy really means using different sources of food from the foods that we've been brought up to really think about as fuel. So most of us will be brought up, eating carbohydrates, good carbohydrates and some bad ones. We all like a bit of sugar here and there, but carbohydrates come in all sorts of foods, and this is the main type of fuel that the body uses for its energy. The problem is that it's not very efficient. And believe it or not, the more efficient fuel is actually fats.
Mm-hmm.
And we've been all brought up to think that fats are bad and can cause build-up in the bloodstream and cause clots and heart disease and even stroke. That's not necessarily the case at all, and it depends on the type of fat. But the idea is that if we use a combination of fats as well as much lower amounts of carbohydrate, we have a much more efficient energy source, which relies more on fats, ketone bodies, that's why it's called ketogenic therapy. And what happens here is that these ketone bodies are much more efficient givers of energy, so that the mitochondria, they can make many more energy molecules, a molecule of fat, shall we say, ketone body, than they can a molecule of a carbohydrate product, for glycolysis, for carbohydrate metabolism. So it's a more efficient fuel, which allows the energy engines in the cells to work more efficiently. And as you can see, you can probably see that if that is happening, then all the downstream effects of a more efficient engine means that, dopamine can be produced, but it's not going to wear itself out. And at some point, it's not going to be produced in too many amounts, because there's just generally more efficient energy going around. And other parts of the brain that are important for regulation can benefit from that. So everybody wins.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're really doing. And it's more complicated than that, because this therapy also is known to boost another transmitter called GABA, which is the inhibitory. So dopamine's like the gas, it's the real get up and go. GABA regulates dopamine. As I was saying earlier, there are other chemicals that regulate dopamine, GABA being one. So what this ketogenic therapy does is boost GABA, which therefore regulates dopamine. So you're getting both. You're getting the regulation of energy, but you're also getting the regulation of the dopamine, so it doesn't get too high.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we think it works. And, it's early days with bipolar disorder. We are running a trial which is going to be finishing just in over a year's time. And we're looking at its effect on the brain in people with bipolar disorder and on mitochondria. And we're really excited, about how that's going.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I can't wait to hear those results. We'll have to have you back. And it sounds like it's, we're talking about this inverted U idea. The idea is that this ketogenic diet could kind of get you more closer to the middle, where you're able to better regulate.
Yeah. And on the one hand, you're going to give yourself more of an energy source, which helps all areas in the brain.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's going to because of its effects on GABA, it's going to regulate the hormone transmitter that's in overdrive to start with. So it has two hits. Now, it also works in many other ways as well to get people to that sweet spot. It works, we think, on immune function, and it works on inflammation, amongst other things. So there are many effects, but generally it's going to make the body just more energy efficient, and as well as regulate transmitters like dopamine.
Mm-hmm.
Another effect of it, of course, is that people tend to lose weight. They don't need to eat so much food in order to get the same amount of energy.
Right.
So less food is laid down as and then become fat. And so therefore people lose weight because they're using up their existing fat stores, and they also are not taking in as much food to start with. So it's people have used it in the past for that. It's also been used for epilepsy. Stated.
Yeah, so there's a precedent for it. And I like how you said earlier, it sounds like it restores that braking function when you're thinking about.
It is exactly. It really regulates. It calms the brain down, and it's been over 100 years of research of the ketogenic diet or therapy in children with epilepsy. Very effective for many children. So yeah, it's it's very promising. So yeah, watch this space. We're very excited about that work. Yeah.
I am as well. We'll stay tuned and we'll share links as they come. I want to pivot now to talking about some of the misperceptions about bipolar. And I know earlier you're like, oh my gosh, there's so many. So what are some things you wish the public knew and understood more about bipolar?
Oh gosh, yes. Well,
how long do we have?
I think the first things we've touched on isn't it the mania? But actually before that, let's just go back to the biggest problem of all, which is how serious and how debilitating this disorder. I mean, it really is at both poles, even if you just think of it simply as two poles, the depression and the mania, they both are hugely debilitating in different ways. And it really has an enormously high suicide rate, arguably the highest of all psychiatric disorders. So it really is astonishing how debilitating it is, but I don't think people realise. The second thing is that it's really common. It's not as common as depression without mania. So we call it, major depressive disorder or unipolar, or more simple. It's not simple, but depression without the mania, which is very common. But it's pretty common. I mean, it depends on what figures or what country, but varies between 1.5 to 2.5% or more of the population. So that's not uncommon. So it's common and it's debilitating, and we don't have great treatments, and the suicide rate is really high. And I wish the general population was sort of given more information about that. I know it's there if people want to read it, but it kind of gets hidden because all people tend to think about is the fact that it's not as common as depression on its own. And so that segues to the mania question. And I think, again, the other misperception, as we were saying earlier, Hilary, is that mania is good for you. It's great. I remember once even here in Pittsburgh, I shan't mention who it was. There was a talk by a health professional who said, oh, yes, bipolar, that's a great disorder to have. I wish I had bipolar disorder because mania is great.
Oh.
That could be, high. And that would be much better than being depressed. And again, this misperception that mania is somehow okay. It's not. In many ways, it's even more dangerous than depression because people can just wear themselves out. And so I think, it's common, it's highly debilitating, suicide rate's really high, treatments aren't great for most people, a lot of people. And we've got this problem with the misperception of mania. And so, and because of all of this, unfortunately, a lot of healthcare professionals are not trained to detect bipolar disorder. So sadly, what does this mean? It means people with bipolar disorder often have to wait forever, but for a minimum of an average of about 10 years before getting the diagnosis. They've gone through many doctors. Oh, it's depression, it's anxiety, it's ADHD. And it's only after sometimes 10 years before they get the diagnosis that they really need, which is bipolar disorder, by which time, can you imagine all the stuff that's going on in the brain, all the cycling? This is damaging the brain. So there's so much that needs to be done. And, I just think if we could just make sure that the word gets out that bipolar disorder is bad for you and it's common and we need better treatment.
Need more research, more treatment.
Suffering from it. and many of whom might not even know that they have bipolar disorder. So,
Right. That's if they even get that diagnosis ultimately.
yeah. It's so sad. I mean, sadly, we know that people with bipolar disorder, not only do they not get the diagnosis of bipolar disorder, they're often misdiagnosed for a long time. And the common diagnosis that people will receive is obviously one of depression, simple unipolar depression, which at least they're getting a diagnosis, at least they're getting some treatment. But unfortunately, what happens is that people are then treated. That's okay, sort of. They're treated antidepressants for the depression when it comes to the attention of the healthcare professionals. But half the time, or some of the time, the mania goes unnoticed, doesn't get reported. People won't report it. They report the depression, but not the mania. So what happens? They get treated for the depression, okay, but that can actually lead to precipitating mania in some people. So it's a double whammy. They don't get the treatment for mania, and the treatment they get for the depression, and actually can make the mania worse, or at least give them a higher risk of becoming manic or hypomanic down the line. It's tragedy. And then that's people who can get a diagnosis. Some people don't even get that.
Right.
It'll be, oh, well, it's your personality, or you need more sleep, which is all true, but it's not enough. People need the definitive diagnosis, and they need treatments as good as we can have at the moment.
Absolutely. So that's why I'm so glad you're here to share the word and spread the actual information about this really debilitating disorder. And what would you recommend for someone who's either thinks they have bipolar disorder, has the diagnosis, has a loved one who's suffering, like from a neuroscience-based perspective, what advice?
Yeah. Well, first of all, get the diagnosis, go and see a healthcare professional. If you can, get advice and check out who might have an interest, which healthcare professionals might have an interest in bipolar disorder, or at least mood disorders in general, which covers the range of unipolar depression right through bipolar disorder. In Pittsburgh, we're very fortunate. We have some world-renowned experts clinically in the diagnosis and treatment of bipolar disorder using treatments that we currently have. I mentioned a few names already. But they usually are people in most big cities who have some interest or know somebody who is available. And then there are some PCPs who are knowledgeable and who have an interest in this. And if they don't, they would be willing to refer perhaps to a specialist. So that will be the first thing, just to make sure that you're getting an expert to assess and advise. And then it's a question of getting the best treatment interventions that you can, again, with experts involved. And right now, of course, the treatments are really medications and some of these interventions and psychotherapies. There are some what we call it brain stimulation or neuromodulation treatments for the depressive side of bipolar disorder that are allowed to be used. And, the transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is what we're using for the mania. There are some forms of that can be used to target different brain regions for depression, but they're not focusing on the mania. That's what we're doing. So that can help some people. But there's hope there. But getting the diagnosis is critical, because until you have the diagnosis, established, confirmed, it's difficult to even begin to get the treatments that you need, or at least start along that pathway. So I would say that's by far and away the most important first step.
Yeah, thank you so much. And before we officially wrap up, I just want to thank you so much. I've learned so much, and I'm so excited to keep track of what you're up to. Is there anything else you'd like to share? Any resources, books, organizations that you can direct listeners to? And of course, we will link to your information if folks want to learn more about Dr. Phillips' work. But anything else you would like to add?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are several sort of websites out there. The Mayo Clinic and National Institutes of Health have excellent websites on disorders if you want to find out more about it. There are books on the subject. I mean, I mentioned Kay Jameson and has an excellent book on bipolar disorder, which, she very learned psychologist and has lived experience with bipolar disorder. So she writes very beautifully, elegantly and eloquently on the subject. I think those are a good starting place. If a person, is more interested in the neuroscience, the brain science, then there are there's a literature. I mean, obviously, I've contributed to that literature. There are colleagues too. Any literature search, or people who have search engines that allow you to do this, I'm sure most people do. You can type in the words bipolar disorder, brain, science, and it will give you a little bit of information along the lines that I've described. And from there, you can get the more detailed, more sort of specialized information. But I'd start with the sort of the websites and Kay James's book. And there are several other sort of sources that you might want to look at, but I would recommend it, and NIH and the Mayo Clinic, Kay James's book.
Amazing. I didn't read that one, so that's now on my summer reading list. Thank you very much. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Phillips. Again, this was amazing. I so appreciate your time and just so excited to see where this research goes. So thank you.